All right, let's take you over to Minnesota now, where a state Senate Republican just resigned. This after 40-year-old Senator Justin Eichorn was charged with allegedly soliciting sex from a minor. Let's bring in CBS News correspondent Chanel Call for more on this story. Chanel, can you break down this case for us?
Yeah, so we've been following this story all day, Liz, and can now confirm that Minnesota Republican State Senator Justin Eichorn has resigned. Now, this happened in the wake of some pretty damning allegations coming from federal prosecutors, and there was also, Liz, growing pressure from lawmakers really on both sides of the aisle here. Now, just to recap for our viewers, federal prosecutors say Eichorn began messaging someone who he thought was 17 years old on March 11th. As it turned out, he was actually communicating with an undercover officer. Now, during those conversations, an undercover officer had multiple times said this purported girl was 17 years old. Despite that, this conversation continued, and Eichorn allegedly asked for several photos. How did this happen? Well, prosecutors say Eichorn answered an online ad that was part of a bigger and broader operation that targets sex trafficking. On Monday, authorities say that he was supposed to meet up with that alleged teenager, and that's when he was charged with attempted coercion or enticement of a minor. On Tuesday, Liz, he was booked into jail, and he's now being held there without bail. But of course, that is what fueled this fallout at the state capitol. Last night, we heard from Senate GOP leader Mark Johnson, and he had said that, look, we're not going to wait for Eichorn to resign. Instead, I'm going to be putting forth a motion to remove him before that happens. Now, that session was slated to kick off at noon today, but before that happened, just a few minutes before that happened, we got word into our newsroom that Eichorn had resigned.
And Chanel, you're keeping an eye on another big story, the Taliban releasing a Delta Airlines mechanic who was detained by Taliban authorities for more than 2 years. What are the details in this story?
Right, so Liz, the State Department is saying George Glassman, who was held by the Taliban for more than 2 years, has now been released. This is someone who the government says was abducted by the Taliban back in December of 2022. He was there as a tourist visiting the country and was just released today as a result of this new deal brokered by the U.S. and Qatar. Glassman is now, we should mention, the third American detainee to be released by the Taliban since January. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio put out a statement this morning. I'll read you part of it. It says, George joins Americans Ryan Corbett and William McKenty, who were released from Afghanistan on the night of President Trump's inauguration and then returned home to their families. It goes on to say, George's release is a positive and constructive step. It's also a reminder that other Americans are still detained in Afghanistan, and President Trump will continue his tireless work to free all Americans unjustly detained around the world. Now, important to note as well that the last two Americans who we just mentioned, those detainees who were released earlier this year, that had happened during the Biden administration, that negotiation, I should say, and it also involved an exchange for someone named Khan Mohammed. This is someone who was sentenced to 2 life terms after being convicted under U.S. narco-terrorism laws. And so I'm saying that to explain that George Glassman, who was just released today, in this particular deal, the U.S. did not have to give up a prisoner. So that's important to note because state officials are saying this was seen as sort of a goodwill gesture as the Taliban is now trying to, quote, normalize relations between the U.S. and Afghanistan.
All right, CBS News correspondent Chanel Call, thank you so much for that update.